Of the PLU. We're very fortunate to have with us today a couple of really well-known scholars. We have Dr. Lee, who's from the North Carolina State University. I met Dr. Lee this past summer. We went to a workshop together and he presented, and I was really impressed with what he was doing, and I did some more research. There are some programs that he developed and I started using in my classroom. My students really love the Abraham Lincoln assignment, where we look at Abraham Lincoln before, during, and after the Civil War. So that was, for me, it was very helpful. And it really fits the inquiry model of what we're looking at, because we're moving towards a different stage. But Dr. Lee has, he's very respected within the social studies community. We're very fortunate to have Dr. Lee here today. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our keynote speaker today, Dr. Lee.
All right, thank you. I appreciate, Juan, thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here. I'm a Georgia native, so I've been in North Carolina for 8 years, but this is home. I grew up in Brunswick. My wife's family lives in Savannah. My father's family's in Waycross, UGA. I taught in Clayton County, and I also had my first job in higher ed at Georgia State, and that's where I got my teaching license. So glad to be back in Georgia. I've spent the last 5 years working on a project called the C3 Framework, and I want to spend some time with y'all this morning telling you about the C3 Framework and about inquiry. Inquiry is a model and approach to teaching in social studies. So, how many of y'all have heard of the C3 Framework? Okay, good. For those of you who haven't, I'm going to give you a little introduction to it. You can see, again, C3 Framework and inquiry is our topic. So these are some words that sometimes get associated with social studies, unfortunately. You hear kids say this is boring, I don't like it, it's a bunch of dates, I have to memorize it. This is kind of a visual stuck in our minds about what social studies looks like. But it doesn't have to be like that. And y'all know that because you're good teachers, and you understand what social studies can be. You understand it can be powerful, that it can challenge kids, it's engaging, it involves collaboration, it can be controversial, it's local and global. There's a lot of powerful opportunities that we have in social studies. We recognize that. And so what we did is we started a quest for the lost ark of the social studies, covenant of the social studies. 5 years ago, we did this in the wake of the publication of the Common Core. You recall probably in the summer of 2010 when the Common Core was published. To our surprise, social studies was included, and many of us walked around, like a dog. We are Indiana Jones. We're really worried. Common Core's come. It's named us. So, it's like this existential crisis. We're at this moment in social studies when we're worried about what's happening. We've lost incredible amounts of instructional time, particularly in elementary grades. Two groups of people came together and took on a challenge to address what was going on with social studies in the early spring of 2011. These two groups joined. One group was actually facilitated by the group that published the Common Core, the Council of Chief School State Officers, CCSSO, and that group is made up of state social studies specialists, like Sean Owens. How many of y'all know Sean? She's the state social studies specialist, and she's a member of this group. And the group commissioned standards in social studies. They were joined by a group of professional organizations like the American Historical Association and National Geographic, Council for Econ Ed, and others. And they came together and said, you know what, let's do a Common Core for social studies. Very ambitious, big idea. I got involved in the process as the chair of the College and University Faculty Assembly, which is the professors group within NCSS, and we were off to the races. So as we worked, we realized there were a lot of problems. We had this vision and this idea, but there were a lot of problems with it. We got realistic, we got serious, and we did what we think is pretty good work. And what we came up with is the C3 Framework. It's not a set of standards. It's a framework. When you open it up and look at it, though, it has stuff in it that looks like standards. And I want to talk a little bit about those and why it was designed the way it was. What we believe the C3 Framework can do, and it was published, by the way, on September 17th, 2013, so a little over a year ago. But what we believe that the C3 can do is it can provide a foundation for new standards. So it contains within it the materials that people can use to develop standards in the places where it's appropriate to develop standards, most typically in states. It can also serve as a companion to existing state standards. We think in large part it helps recalibrate this relationship we have with literacy, because what was going on in 2010 when the Common Core was published is that we were being told what literacy should look like in social studies. So through the C3, what we're doing is taking back control of that and saying, yeah, but in social studies we do things differently. We do things for a different purpose, and so it recalibrates that relationship. It can provide guidance on professional learning. There are implications for curriculum instruction, and there's also implications for assessment reform. We know that assessment is one of the biggest sort of boulders or roadblocks that are in our way right now in terms of trying to, I think at least, realize the kind of social studies instruction that we want. We have these tests that just don't line up with what we want to do in the classroom. So all of these things are important, but in particular, you're going to see in a minute, one of the things that we're trying to take on is curriculum and instruction. So let me say a couple of things about the C3 framework. It's built on a foundation with 3 pillars. Something we call an inquiry arc, literacy, which you might expect given the kind of the origin of the work, and this notion of civic life. The inquiry arc is essentially a concept that animates the C3 framework. The inquiry arc it's a suggestive of something that can happen in the social studies instructionally and with regard to learning. It involves the movement that you would expect in an arc. It begins with the notion of asking questions, and it leads to a point where you can use something that you've learned in an inquiry to be a better citizen, to act in your civic life. So this is a visual that kind of illustrates what the inquiry arc looks like, but it is in fact made up of 4 dimensions. The first dimension is about questioning, developing questions and planning an inquiry. And that's where we believe inquiry work in the social studies begins, with the development of questions. The second dimension is about the disciplines that make up social studies. And so this dimension focuses on applying disciplinary tools. Now, a decision was made in the work on the C3 framework to focus on 4 core disciplines, but it doesn't mean that that's all of social studies. But the 4 core disciplines are civic. It isn't really a discipline. Political science is a discipline. We call it civics in K-12. Economics, geography, and history. And so Dimension 2 tries to capture what these disciplines say about the tools within their field and the ways of thinking in those fields. Dimension 3 is about what you do once you have information from a discipline. You evaluate sources which emerge in the disciplines, and then you use those for a purpose. You use them to do things. You use evidence to be able to say things. And then ultimately, the 4th dimension is about doing something with what you've learned. So you've gone through an inquiry, you've asked a question, you've worked with the disciplines, you've gotten sources, you've found stuff that you can use as evidence, and now you know something. So what? Well, the so what is you communicate, you tell other people what you know, and importantly, you take action on it. You use it to inform the way you live your civic life, because that's why we do social studies, not to stuff kids' heads with dates. They don't like it, we don't like it, it's not particularly useful. We do it so you can understand how to live in the world, how to act, how to be civil, and how to have a productive democratic life. So that's the first foundation. The second foundation is literacy, and this is in italics at the top. It's just some text from the C3 framework. We really believe strongly when we developed the C3 that literacy needed to be at the core of what we're doing in social studies. We recognize that it's an important part of what happens in all classes, and so we buy into this notion of a shared responsibility. Social studies teachers share the responsibility of literacy instruction with the rest of the teachers in the building. And we have a particularly important role, okay? And so there's a lot of connections to the Common Core here, but the particularly important role are the kind of things that you see here. We focus on argumentation. Not argumentation like you're wrong and I'm right, but argumentation like you're trying to make your point. And you're making your point with evidence. And you're doing that because you work with sources that come from the disciplines. And you do that through discourse that's civil. So what we did in the process of building out the C3 framework is say, these are some of the literacies that are unique to social studies. This is what we can do in social studies. This is where we can make our contribution in literacy. And we believe that those literacies come in 2 flavors, inquiry literacies and disciplinary literacies. So this is a long list of the kind of things that are kind of suggested within the C3 framework. But that first set are focused on the things that students do in an inquiry, such as asking questions and evaluating sources and making claims, etc. And the second set are things that are done within the disciplines. So the people that are in the disciplines that do work in those disciplines, in economics, they learn how to make economic decisions using data. In history, they learn how to determine the purpose of a historical source. So across the C3 framework, these types of literacies are supported.